let's just analyze this as the way lawyers should analyze this and whether it is permissible or not. So the arguments that we're hearing on this are personal liberty versus sort of greater good liberty. And, people make very wise arguments on both sides. For the most part, it's really individual rights versus the rights of the community. So people that are arguing, hey, you shouldn't be able to mandate that I get a vaccine, are advocating for their individual rights, their individual right to liberty, that you can't deprive me of my right to life, liberty, or property that's in the Constitution. So you can't make me do that. But there's a counter argument to that, which is the rights of the community. And that corresponding right is that your community members have a corresponding right to liberty. And that being their interest to be free from unreasonable health dangers on that side. So these are really two conflicting things here, both with people pointing to life, liberty, under the Constitution and due process. I have the right to do this. Now, so what do we do as lawyers when you're asked that? Because we can have a philosophical argument about these things. And then so from a political standpoint or a philosophical standpoint, you and I may differ on that and say, individual versus rights of the community. So as lawyers, though, we look to guidance. We look to prior situations to see if there's guidance. And there actually is. So in 1904, a man by the name of Henning Jacobson, who had previous bad experiences with vaccines, and his child had a previous bad experience with vaccine, did not want to get a vaccine mandated by the state of Massachusetts for smallpox. So back then, smallpox had existed for a long time, and smallpox was way worse than COVID. It was killing about 1/3 of the people that were infected with it. So this was a really big problem. Smallpox dated back even to Revolutionary War times. And even our first president, our first commander-in-chief, General Washington, he mandated that his troops get smallpox vaccines during the war, although there was no government mandate in that place. We didn't have a government. But Mr. Jacobson decided to challenge the Massachusetts mandate, which said, get the vaccine or we can fine you $5. And he said, no, this is not right. I have a right to life, liberty, and property on my own, and you can't infringe on that without giving me due process. And what he argued was, I want my due process. I want to hash out in an open courtroom why the vaccine is bad or won't work and I shouldn't have to get it. And a Massachusetts court said no, said the government had a right to institute this as a public health measure to protect society as a whole. And so you're not even having a trial, and it's not a denial of your due process in this particular circumstance. So the case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and we have a Supreme Court decision written by an extremely famous, very conservative judge, at least by his reputation, named John Marshall Harlan. So John Marshall Harlan is a famous judge that a lot of people look up to, it, even some of our current Supreme Court members, because he was known as the great dissenter. So he didn't really go along with things. And he wrote the majority opinion that was an overwhelming majority opinion, 7-2, saying that the Massachusetts law can be upheld. And what he said was society based on the rule that each one is a law unto himself would soon be confronted with disorder and anarchy. So essentially what he was saying was the government had a right, it's not infringing on your rights, to protect the rights of your fellow community members by mandating that you do something like this. So he is essentially saying, look, a community that is in danger of a health outbreak like that back then was the smallpox situation, their elected government officials have the right to do something about it. And so we upheld the law. So there were some really interesting quotes from that case and that strangely will become relevant if there are challenges to the COVID mandates now. And one of them was he wrote, and you can read it in this decision of Jacobson versus Massachusetts in 1904. And Judge Harlan, the great dissenter, wrote, in this case for the majority, he wrote, real liberty for all could not exist under the operation of a principle which recognizes the right of each individual person to use his own, whether in respect to his person or property, regardless of the injury that may be done to others. So Judge Harlan here is saying, look, you can't do this. You're going to have to follow this mandate. And that went very much in line what Judge Harlan ruled there with other mandates that happened. So for example, back then you had a lot of cruise ship passengers that were on cruise ships where there were cholera outbreaks. And so the cruise ships or the local ports and governments would say, everybody on the ship's going to have to quarantine. And people didn't like that. No, you can't. I'm free. I have a right to get off this boat. But no, the local authority said, no, you don't in this circumstance because there's a cholera outbreak on your boat. We're going to quarantine you. That's upheld. Other things that were upheld under this principle that Judge Harlan wrote were inscriptions, were drafts. So, from time to time, the United States government said, we're going to institute a mandatory draft. And people didn't like that at times too and said, you can't make me go into the Army. But the Supreme Court then said, well, no, in order to, for the greater good of society here, there are certain things we can enact that will force you to do things that are infringement on maybe your individual liberty, but foster a more bigger, greater good picture. And so that principle has existed for a long period of time. I think the most relevant one in my lifetime, because I didn't live through smallpox or cholera outbreaks, might be seatbelts. So I think it's the 1970s, many state and then federal governments instituted laws saying we're going to require you to wear a seatbelt. And we saw many of the very same arguments that we're seeing now with respect to vaccine mandates, where people said, if I don't want to wear my seatbelt and kill go through the windshield, that should be up to me. You as a government can't tell me what to do. Can't make me wear this to protect my own safety. Except the government had a counter argument and said, well, actually we can, because the amount of deaths that are being caused and the amount of injuries that are being caused and then its effect on society as a whole. And that effect would be financial. So if you're injured in a car accident because you're not wearing your seatbelt and then you find yourself in a hospital and getting medical treatment, well, taxpayers may bear that burden. So the United States government said, no, we have an interest in regulating that and preventing society as a whole from bearing a financial burden for people not wearing their seatbelts, which we know can prevent some of this. So there's another balancing act, which was, of course, now we all take it for granted. Of course, it's nobody has a problem saying with the seatbelt mandate that it makes sense. But back then, when seatbelt mandates came out, there was a lot of pushback, just like we're seeing now, by people in court challenges saying, hey, you can't make me do this, or you shouldn't be able to make me do this. And the courts actually found otherwise. So, but a lot of this traces back to Judge Harlan and his decision. And actually, maybe I'm going to leave you with one last quote from Judge Harlan in this decision, which I thought was very eloquent. And he wrote that in every well-ordered society charged with the duty of conserving the safety of its members, the right of the individual in respect to his liberty may at times, under pressure of great dangers, be subjected to restraint, to be enforced by reasonable regulations as the safety of the general public may demand. That's what Judge Harlan wrote in 1904 in a challenge to the smallpox mandated vaccine in the state of Massachusetts. I suspect we're going to see some challenges to the mandates by individual employers or local state governments, or even a federal government if it comes to that. We're going to see some challenges that are going to find its way to the Supreme Court. If we do, everyone's going to look back to this decision in 1904 written by Judge Harlan for guidance. Should be very interesting to see.